Hollywood's golden age, a pregnant actress was not a woman expecting a child. She was a liability, a problem to be managed, hidden, or quietly eliminated from the schedule before anyone noticed. 9 of the most famous women in the world faced that reality, and every single one of them chose to fight back in the only way available to them: in silence, on camera, and completely alone. The pregnancy that changed television forever. In the autumn of 1952, Lucille Ball was the most watched woman in America. I Love Lucy had become something the television industry had never quite seen before. A genuine cultural phenomenon, commanding 30 million viewers every single week, her face reproduced on magazine covers from coast to coast, her comedic timing the subject of awe from every performer who shared a stage or a screen with her. She and her husband, D.C. Arnaz, had built something remarkable. A show that felt less like entertainment and more like a weekly visit from the most beloved family in the country. Audiences trusted Lucy Ricardo the way they trusted very few figures in public life. She was warmth and laughter and the particular comfort of the familiar. And then Lucille Ball discovered she was pregnant. What happened next would change American television permanently, but not before it nearly dismantled everything she had built. The executives at CBS did not receive the news with joy. In the early 1950s, the unspoken rules of broadcast entertainment were rigid and largely unexamined. And one of the most firmly held of those unspoken rules was that pregnancy, the condition, the word, the visible physical reality of it, did not belong on the American television screen. Audiences might understand, in the abstract, that their favorite stars were human beings with human lives. But seeing those lives in such undeniable physical evidence was something the network considered a step too far. The word pregnant was formally prohibited from being used on air. The approved term was expected. The difference, from CBS's perspective, was meaningful. What followed was one of the more extraordinary negotiations in the history of American broadcasting. Lucille Ball and D.C. Arnaz, through their production company Desilu, pushed back. They argued that hiding the pregnancy was both impractical and dishonest, that their audience was composed of real women who would recognize and respond to what they were seeing, and that pretending otherwise would insult the very viewers who had made the show what it was. The compromise that emerged was unprecedented. The pregnancy would be written into the show. Lucy Ricardo would be expecting a child. And in a decision that speaks volumes about the anxieties of the era, CBS assembled a panel of religious consultants, a Catholic priest, a Protestant minister, and a Jewish rabbi, to review and approve every episode that depicted Lucy's condition before it could be broadcast. Consider what that decision reveals about the era. The most watched program in America required the formal blessing of 3 clergymen simply to acknowledge that its star was expecting a child. The network that had turned Lucille Ball into a national institution did not trust itself or its audience to navigate that fact without ecclesiastical supervision. It is one of the most extraordinary bureaucratic arrangements in the history of entertainment. And it passed almost without comment at the time because it seemed, to everyone involved, entirely reasonable. Every script was reviewed, every episode was approved, and not one of those clergymen ever objected to a single scene because the writing was so warm, so human, and so clearly rooted in love that there was simply nothing to object to. Those who followed the production closely during that period later recalled the tension between the network's caution and the creative team's determination. The studio audiences, by contrast, required no convincing at all. They roared, episode after episode, episodum. They responded to Lucy Ricardo's pregnancy with the recognition of people who had lived those experiences themselves and who had never before seen them reflected back from a television screen. For the first time in the history of the medium, a pregnant woman was being shown as funny, capable, lovable, and fully human, not as a condition to be managed off-screen, but as a person whose experience deserved to be witnessed. The women watching in their living rooms understood exactly what they were seeing. Many of them had never seen anything like it before. Many of them wept. Behind all of this ran a story that the cameras never captured. The marriage between Lucille Ball and Desi Arnaz, so perfectly framed for public consumption, was under a private strain that no amount of successful television could resolve. Those who knew the couple well in those years described a relationship of genuine feeling complicated by DC's persistent infidelities and the particular loneliness of building a professional empire alongside a personal one that was slowly coming apart. The laughter on screen was real. The perfection it implied was not. The episode in which little Ricky Ricardo came into the world aired on January 19, 1953. The same night Lucille Ball gave birth to Desi Arnaz Jr. at Cedars of Lebanon Hospital in Los Angeles. 44 million Americans watched the fictional birth. More people watched that single episode of I Love Lucy than watched the inauguration of President Dwight D. Eisenhower the following morning. Think about what that number means in human terms. Across the country, in living rooms from Maine to California, families had gathered around their television sets. Fathers who had come home from work, children in pajamas who had been allowed to stay up late, grandmothers sitting in their usual chairs, all of them watching the same woman at the same moment bring a child into the fictional world. And in a hospital across the city, the real woman was doing exactly the same thing, alone and privately, with no audience at all. 2 births, one that 44 million people witnessed, one that almost no one saw. The contrast between those two realities is as complete a picture of what it meant to be a female star in the golden age as anything that has ever been recorded. The real birth was handled quietly, privately, almost invisibly by comparison. The woman who had fought for the right to be seen, truly seen, and in the full human complexity of what she was living, had won that fight on behalf of every woman who came after her. She had done so while her own marriage was already beginning its long, slow unraveling. The glamour was genuine. The cost was genuine too. Lucy fought to be seen and won. The next woman on our list was Hollywood's reigning glamour queen. And she was hiding something that no amount of sequins and carefully chosen camera angles could conceal forever. The Sweater Girl's secret. By 1942, Lana Turner was one of the most recognizable women on the planet. MGM had spent years constructing the image with extraordinary care. The platinum waves, the fitted sweaters that had given her a nickname she would carry for the rest of her life. The carefully orchestrated public appearances that made her seem like glamour distilled into human form. Fan mail arrived at the studio by truckload. Magazine editors competed for her image. She was, in the language of the studio system at its most fluent, a property of immense and carefully maintained value. What was happening behind that image in late 1942 was considerably more complicated. Turner had married bandleader Stephen Crane in a ceremony that turned out to be legally invalid. Crane's divorce from his previous wife had not yet been finalized under California law, which meant the marriage had no legal standing. The annulment that followed was itself a subject of quiet management by the studio's publicity apparatus. Then Turner discovered she was pregnant. The father was Crane. The situation required a solution that would satisfy the legal requirements, manage the public narrative, and protect the image that MGM had spent years and considerable sums constructing. The solution arrived in March of 1943, when Turner and Crane were quietly remarried in Tijuana, Mexico. The timing of the pregnancy relative to the sequence of marriages was not something the studio was eager to illuminate. While all of this was being arranged and managed, Lana Turner was on an active film set. Slightly Dangerous was MGM's most ambitious investment in her as a solo star. The first picture the studio had built entirely around her, without the support of a Clark Gable or a Spencer Tracy to share the marquee. The pressure was considerable, and the role itself was not a forgiving one. Dee Turner played a small-town waitress who reinvents herself as a socialite and comedienne, a character who was required to be physically light, effortlessly graceful, and radiantly glamorous in every frame. There were comic sequences, scenes requiring quick physical movement, moments where the camera lingered deliberately on the image that had made her famous. Every one of those scenes had to be delivered by a woman who was 2 months pregnant, in fitted costumes that were being quietly adjusted between every fitting, performing an ease and lightness that she was nowhere close to feeling. The customers who worked on that production quietly let out seams and made adjustments that the camera would never detect. What that composure cost her in purely physical terms was something audiences never considered. The fitted suits and carefully tailored dresses that defined her screen image were not forgiving garments under ordinary circumstances. Under the circumstances of an advancing pregnancy, every costume fitting was a negotiation. Every scene that required her to move with the fluid, unencumbered ease of Hollywood's most glamorous star was a small performance within the larger one. Del Armstrong, her personal makeup artist and one of the few people on the production who knew the full picture, later recalled a woman who arrived on set each morning fully prepared and fully composed, who gave the camera everything it asked for, and who retreated at the end of each day into a private exhaustion that the public version of Lana Turner was never permitted to show. He recalled watching her walk to her dressing room after a particularly long shooting day, still perfectly composed from the outside, and moving, he said, like someone carrying a weight the camera had never been allowed to see. Contemporary accounts from those who worked on the production described the machinery of concealment operating with the efficiency of long practice, because it was, for MGM's wardrobe and camera departments, precisely that. What was unusual about Slightly Dangerous was not that a star was pregnant during filming, It was that this particular star was simultaneously managing a legal complication, a studio image of carefully constructed glamour, and the physical demands of carrying a child, all while delivering the performance on which her first solo star vehicle depended. Cheryl Crane was born in July of 1943, and the studio announced the birth warmly and managed the story of the remarriage to Crane in a way that minimized any arithmetic that audiences might find inconvenient. For a time, the machinery held. Turner's career continued its ascent. The pregnancy hidden on the set of Slightly Dangerous became one quiet footnote in a life that would eventually produce far louder and more devastating chapters. But the machinery of managed appearances, applied year after year across a lifetime, creates pressure with nowhere to go. Turner gave birth to Cheryl Crane while Hollywood polished the glamour and kept the secrets and asked no questions it did not want answered. What the world could not yet know was that 15 years later, in the spring of 1958, that accumulated pressure would arrive at Turner's home in Beverly Hills in a way that no studio in the history of Hollywood could have managed, controlled, or made to disappear. The hidden pregnancy during Slightly Dangerous was simply the first chapter in a story whose final pages would be written in ways no publicist could have anticipated. Lana Turner's secret was managed by MGM's well-practiced machinery. Our next subject had no studio machinery to protect her, only a title, a palace, and an entire world watching her every move, with calculators in hand. The Ice Queen and the inconvenient arithmetic. There has never been quite another story in the history of Hollywood like the one that began in April of 1956, when Grace Kelly, Hitchcock's preferred blonde, Academy Award winner, and the embodiment of a particular cool and aristocratic American elegance, sailed out of New York Harbor aboard the SS Constitution, bound for Monaco and a life that no studio could have scripted more improbably. The marriage to Prince Rainier III of Monaco had captured the imagination of the world in a way that even Hollywood at its most extravagant could not quite manufacture. Here was the real thing. A genuine prince, a genuine principality, a genuine fairy tale with a genuine crown at the end of it. The civil ceremony took place on April 18, 1956. The religious ceremony followed on April 19th. The world watched both with the kind of attention that is ordinarily reserved for events of historical consequence, which, in its own way, this was. Princess Caroline Louise Marguerite of Monaco was born on January 23, 1957. Those who followed the calendar closely noted that 9.5 months separated the civil ceremony from the birth. Approximately 8 months separated the religious ceremony from that same event. The arithmetic was not complicated. It was performed quietly and with considerable interest by observers on both sides of the Atlantic throughout the final months of 1956. The Monegasque court, the Catholic Church with its institutional investment in the sanctity of the sacrament that had been so publicly celebrated, and the international press corps that had followed every detail of the wedding. All of them had something very specific at stake in the narrative that those numbers suggested. Grace Kelly said nothing. Her public bearing throughout the months in question was exactly what it had always been. Composed, gracious, impeccable. She had spent a decade in Hollywood learning to give the camera precisely what was required and nothing more. And she brought that discipline to her new role with the thoroughness she brought to everything. If the whispers reached her, and they certainly did, she gave no indication that they had. What those whispers revealed was not scandal, but impossibility. The world had decided that Grace Kelly was the one woman who operated entirely outside the ordinary human experiences that the rest of her gender navigated. She had been granted the fairy tale. The fairy tale, in the imagination of her audience, did not include the possibility of choices made before the vows were formally exchanged in the eyes of the church. Her composure in the face of those whispers was, in its way, the finest performance of a career that had already produced 2 masterpieces and an Academy Award. What made the silence even more poignant was the knowledge of what Kelly had walked away from to enter that palace. In the months before and after her marriage, she had been offered roles that would have extended and deepened a film career that was still, at 26, in its early chapters. Directors who had worked with her spoke openly about what they believed she was capable of, a range and a depth that her relatively brief filmography had only begun to suggest. Alfred Hitchcock, who understood her screen presence better than almost anyone, considered her irreplaceable. She would later confide to close friends that there were mornings in the palace when she would stand at her window and think about the scripts she had left unread on a desk in California. Roles that went to other women, performances that belonged, in some parallel life, entirely to her. The films she never made are their own kind of quiet loss, belonging to the history of cinema as much as to the history of any one woman's life. The speculation about the arithmetic was never confirmed in print during her lifetime. Princess Caroline grew up to become a figure of considerable presence in her own right. Grace Kelly herself gave up a career she genuinely loved when she entered the palace. And those who knew her well said she never entirely stopped missing it. She carried the particular weight of a woman who had been made into a symbol and was required to inhabit that symbol with perfect consistency for the rest of her days. In public, at banquets, on state occasions, before the cameras that had once been her instrument and were now her permanent audience. She managed it with a grace, the word is unavoidable, that was entirely her own. If you are finding these stories as remarkable as we do, take a moment right now to subscribe so you never miss another journey into Hollywood's hidden history. There are 6 more revelations ahead, and they only grow more extraordinary from here. Grace Kelly carried her secret with the composure of a trained actress and a reigning princess. Our next star carried hers for 60 years, and the secret was not about herself alone, or the pregnancy she hid. Twice, Loretta Young was, in the mid-1930s, one of the most celebrated actresses in Hollywood. She was also one of the most visibly, publicly devout, a Catholic whose faith was not a studio invention, but a genuine and deeply held commitment that shaped every significant decision of her life. On the set of a film, she was known to levy fines on crew members who used profanity. Her image was inseparable from her virtue. The two things were, for her audience, one thing. In the winter of 1934 and into early 1935, Young filmed The Call of the Wild opposite Clark Gable in the mountains of the Pacific Northwest. Gable was married. Young was not, but she had her faith and her image and everything that both of those things required of her. And what happened between them during that production in the Oregon wilderness has been the subject of considerable discussion in the decades since. Young herself, in the final years of her life, used the language of violation to describe it. What is documented is the outcome. She returned from that location and was pregnant. She knew immediately that the situation was without any clean resolution. Her studio, 20th Century Pictures, would have applied pressure toward termination if the pregnancy became known. And termination was, for Loretta Young, against everything her faith held sacred. There was no option that did not require sacrifice. She chose the sacrifice she could live with. What followed was a piece of planning so meticulous that it held for 3 decades. Young completed 2 additional films while the pregnancy was still concealable, maintaining her public schedule with calculated care, appearing at industry events, giving interviews, being seen in precisely the right measure to forestall any suspicion. She attended premieres in the later months wearing gowns that had been specifically constructed to conceal what no ordinary evening dress was designed to hide. And she did it so convincingly that not one reporter who saw her that season put a single word of suspicion into print. Then she developed, in the language of the studio publicity machine, a condition requiring extended rest and travel. She journeyed to England. She was reported, in the society pages that tracked her movements, to be recuperating from an unnamed ailment that had troubled her since childhood. She returned to California in late 1935 and gave birth to a daughter in Venice, California, on November 6th of that year. The child was placed in a Catholic home, while Young arranged the next phase of the plan. Several months later, Loretta Young announced that she was adopting a young girl. She collected her biological daughter from the Catholic home, brought her home as an adopted child, and named her Judy. The press accepted the story. The studio asked no questions it did not want answered. Hollywood insiders whispered, as they always did. But whispers in Hollywood in 1935 did not find their way into print through the mechanisms that would later make such concealment impossible. The fiction held. Judy Lewis grew up in a world that did not add up. She was told she was adopted, and she accepted that. But there were things that adoption did not explain. The particular way that certain people in Hollywood looked at her and then looked away. The conversations that stopped when she entered a room. The sense that the adults around her were navigating something they had agreed not to name. She looked in mirrors and saw a face that was familiar in ways she could not account for. She watched films and felt, in certain moments, an inexplicable and unsettling recognition. She grew up knowing the official story and feeling, in the wordless way that children feel the things they are not told, that the official story was not the whole story. In 1966, when she was 30 years old, she confronted her mother directly. What happened in that room between Loretta Young and her daughter has been described in Judy's own memoir and in the accounts of those she confided in afterward. Young did not deny it. She sat with the weight of what she had been carrying for 30 years, and she told her daughter the truth, that the man whose face Judy had been seeing in her own reflection since childhood was Clark Gable. and that he had never known she existed in the way a father is supposed to know. Judy Lewis later wrote that the confirmation was both a relief and a fresh wound simultaneously. The relief of finally having a true story to inhabit, and the wound of understanding, fully and at last, the dimensions of the deception. Clark Gable had departed this world 6 years before that conversation, and had never once acknowledged the daughter he had fathered. The man who had been called the King of Hollywood had left that particular obligation entirely unmet. Young carried the weight of the deception for the rest of her life. Those who knew her in her later years described a woman who had made a choice under impossible circumstances and spent 60 years living with its consequences, including the consequence of having deceived the very person she had been trying to protect. The reconciliation between mother and daughter, when it came, arrived quietly and without ceremony. Two women reaching across 3 decades of silence towards something that could not be fully repaired, but could, at last, be honestly named. It arrived late. It arrived nonetheless. Judy Lewis went on to become an advocate for the rights of adopted children and for greater transparency in the adoption process, while turning the particular pain of her origins into something that helped others. Loretta Young's secret required years of architecture and decades of careful maintenance. Our next star managed her secret through a completely different method. Not elaborate planning, but sheer, unshakable professional composure. The perfectly maintained illusion. To understand what Claudette Colbert represented in the golden age of Hollywood, you need to understand the particular quality of control she brought to every aspect of her professional life. This was a woman who had negotiated and won a contractual provision requiring that she be photographed exclusively from her left side. A demand that directors accommodated, not because they were forced to, but because Colbert's value to a production was sufficiently clear that the accommodation made practical sense. She arrived on set with every detail of her performance already fully realized. She was, in the language of the directors and producers who worked with her across 4 decades, a luxury. The kind of professional whose presence on a picture elevated everything around her simply through the example of her preparation and her standards. She was also, in a way that was unusual for the era and for the industry, intensely private. Not in the manner of a star carefully managed by a studio publicity department. That kind of privacy was manufactured, and everyone in Hollywood understood it as such. Colbert's privacy was personal, constitutional, a genuine preference for keeping the interior of her life separate from the public performance of it. She did not offer her private self as content. This was a decision, not a circumstance. When Colbert became pregnant during her active years, she managed the situation with the same thoroughness she brought to every other professional challenge. Customers made adjustments without announcement. Schedules accommodated what needed to be accommodated. Camera placement addressed what it needed to address. The production records from that period reflect nothing that suggested crisis or drama. Because for Colbert, there was none. There was only a woman of extraordinary self-possession, handling a private matter with private competence, and declining to invite the world's participation in something that did not belong to the world. What makes Colbert's story remarkable is not the concealment itself, but what she continued to produce while managing it. Consider the specific demands of her work during this period. Since You Went Away, released in 1944, required her to carry the emotional weight of a wartime picture almost entirely on her own. A performance of sustained grief, hope, and quiet endurance that ran for nearly 3 hours and left audiences shaken. The picture demanded everything she had, and she delivered it with a completeness that earned her an Academy Award nomination. She was doing this work, this emotionally excavating, physically exhausting, technically demanding work, while managing a private reality that she had decided, with characteristic finality, was simply not anyone else's business. The pregnancy did not interrupt her work. The work did not reveal the pregnancy. The two things ran in parallel, and the audience saw only the result. Colleagues who worked alongside her during that period described a professional who appeared to exist in a state of permanent readiness, always prepared, always present, never visibly burdened by anything the camera was not supposed to see. The historical record on the specific details of this period is itself a kind of evidence. There is very little to find, not because something was suppressed in the way that other secrets in this history were suppressed, but because Colbert generated almost nothing that required suppression. She simply did not perform her private life for public consumption, and so there was nothing to conceal and nothing to manage. The machinery that other studios ran at full capacity on behalf of their stars sat largely idle in Colbert's case, because she had rendered it unnecessary. In an era that demanded its female stars surrender every corner of their existence to the appetite of an audience that considered that surrender part of the transaction, Claudette Colbert's refusal to do so was a quiet and consistent act of something that looks, from this distance, very much like dignity. She worked until she was nearly 90 years old. She remained, until the end, entirely herself, giving the camera her left side and keeping everything else. Claudette Colbert's story is one of composed, private strength. Our next subject needed every ounce of that same strength, because what she was protecting was not an image, but a life she was terrified of losing. The pregnancy she fought to keep, Sophia Loren, in the early 1960s, was something beyond a film star. She was a phenomenon, an Oscar-winning actress whose fame crossed every language and cultural boundary without translation, whose face was one of the most recognized on the planet, whose screen presence carried a warmth and a power that audiences in a dozen countries responded to with something close to devotion. She had come from nothing, from the rubble of post-war Naples, and she had arrived at the pinnacle of everything. By any visible measure, she had it all. What she did not have, and what she wanted with an urgency that the public never saw, was a child. Her marriage to producer Carlo Ponti had been legally complicated from the beginning. Italian law at the time did not recognize his Mexican divorce from his first wife, which created a situation that required years of legal navigation across multiple jurisdictions before it was fully resolved. Through all of that complexity, the desire for a child was constant, and the reality of it arrived and was then taken away in ways that left marks that no amount of professional triumph could reach or erase. She became pregnant. She lost the pregnancy. She became pregnant again. She lost that one too. Those who were close to her during those years described a woman who maintained her public composure with extraordinary discipline, while privately carrying a grief that existed entirely outside the vocabulary of celebrity. It was not the grief of a career setback, or a difficult production, or a professional disappointment. It was the grief of a woman who wanted something fundamental and kept losing it, quietly, in private, with no audience and no consolation. From the adoration of millions who had no idea what she was enduring between the public appearances, she smiled for the cameras. She gave her interviews. She accepted her awards. And she went home to a sorrow that the cameras never captured. When Loren became pregnant again in the mid-1960s, her doctors were direct with her about the risks, and the history of previous losses made this pregnancy fragile in ways that required careful management. Near total rest was prescribed. Weeks at a time in which she barely moved, barely received visitors, barely permitted herself the ordinary activities of daily life for fear that any disruption might cost her what she had already lost twice. Those close to her during this period described a household operating under a kind of quiet, sustained vigilance. Every meal considered, every exertion weighed, every visitor assessed for the stress they might introduce. Loren herself later described lying still in the darkened rooms of her home and bargaining, in the wordless language of pure wanting, with whatever force in the universe was deciding the outcome. She said afterward that those weeks were simultaneously the most frightening and the most clarifying of her life. The moment when she understood, with complete certainty, that nothing she had ever achieved on a screen came close to mattering as much as what was happening in that quiet room. The physical demands of a film career, the early calls, the long hours on set, the travel, the costumes, the performance itself, were precisely what the pregnancy could not sustain if it was to survive. And yet complete withdrawal from public life would generate scrutiny of exactly the kind she needed to avoid. A star of Loren's magnitude who simply disappeared from view invited questions that a pregnancy she was not yet willing to announce could not survive. The solution was the one that the Golden Age had refined across decades of practice. Carefully managed appearances, adjusted costuming, revised camera positions, colleagues sworn to a silence they kept without exception. On productions where her involvement was unavoidable, the shooting schedule was arranged to front-load her scenes in the earliest and least visible weeks of the pregnancy. Production records from that period reflect a woman of absolute determination. Someone who understood precisely what was at stake and who brought to the protection of this pregnancy the same focus and discipline she brought to every great performance of her career. Carlo Ponti Jr. was born on December 29, 1968. Loren, speaking of his arrival in later years, was consistently clear about what it meant to her. Any award, any critical recognition, any professional achievement, all of it, in her own accounting, ranked below the fact of his existence. The concealment had not been an act of calculation. It had been an act of love directed at something that could not yet speak for itself, carried out by a woman who understood from painful personal experience how easily that love could be taken away. We would love to know which of these stories has moved you most, and which Golden Age star you believe deserves her own full video. Leave your answer in the comments below. We read everyone. Sophia Loren concealed her pregnancy out of love and fear in equal measure. Our next story involves a woman whose hidden pregnancy was entangled in something far beyond the personal. A legal and religious controversy that had already made her the most publicly condemned actress in America. The pregnancy nobody was supposed to notice. In 1947, the Archbishop of Los Angeles stood before his congregation and condemned one of Hollywood's most beloved actresses by name. The woman he was condemning was known to audiences across America as the kindest, most virtuous nurse in the movies. The compassionate, capable, morally reliable presence of the Dr. Kildare film series. A role she had inhabited across multiple pictures with a warmth and a believability that audiences found entirely trustworthy. In an era when the images projected by Hollywood stars carried genuine cultural weight, Lorraine Day's image was one of the most reassuring available. She was a virtue in a white uniform. She was the woman you wanted beside you in a moment of crisis. And the Archbishop of Los Angeles had just told his congregation, in public, from the pulpit, that she had done something that the church could not condone. The sequence of events that produced this outcome had begun when Day fell in love with Leo Durocher, the baseball manager whose combative public personality had made him one of the most controversial figures in American sport. Durocher was in the process of divorcing his wife, Estelle Taylor, but that divorce was not yet final under California law when Day obtained a divorce of her own in Mexico and married him. The marriage took place in January of 1947. California's legal establishment took a dim view of Mexican divorces obtained under these circumstances. The Archbishop of Los Angeles took an even dimmer view of the remarriage itself, delivering a public condemnation that made headlines across the country. A California judge ruled that Day's Mexican divorce was invalid, which meant that under California law, her marriage to Durocher did not legally exist. For a period of months, Lorraine Day and Leo Durocher occupied a peculiar legal position, married in their own understanding and in the eyes of every jurisdiction except California, where they spent a significant portion of their lives. They were, depending on who was being asked and under what authority, either a lawfully married couple or two individuals living in a situation the state declined to recognize. Their mail arrived at the same address. Their names appeared together in the social columns. And in California's official reckoning, they were strangers. In the middle of all of this, Day was pregnant. The Archbishop's condemnation was not merely a religious statement, and it had immediate, tangible consequences that reached into the practical reality of Day's daily life and professional existence. Parish organizations across Southern California called for audiences to avoid her films. Theater owners in heavily Catholic communities quietly removed her pictures from their schedules. Fan mail that had once arrived in warm, admiring quantities turned hostile almost overnight, with letters accusing her of hypocrisy and moral failure. The woman who had spent years building an image of wholesome, trustworthy virtue found that image weaponized against her. The very qualities that had made audiences love her were now being cited as evidence that she had betrayed something they had believed in. She walked through this in public without visible distress, which was, under the circumstances, its own remarkable performance. The pregnancy proceeded with as much quiet as could be managed under circumstances that did not lend themselves to quiet. The combination of the church condemnation, the legal ambiguity, the theater boycotts, and the public attention that all of it had generated made Lorraine Day's private life an unavoidable subject of public discussion. She managed it with a composure that deserves more recognition than history has typically given it. Continuing to work, continuing to appear in public, continuing to behave as a woman who had done nothing that required apology or explanation. While the Archbishop's condemnation echoed in parish halls across Southern California, the legal situation was resolved in their favor after months of proceedings that required considerable effort and considerable patience. The marriage was ultimately recognized. The pregnancy was carried to term without incident. What did not survive the episode, at least not intact, was Day's standing as one of Hollywood's most bankable leading women. The studios that had valued her wholesome image found that same image now carrying associations they were not equipped to manage comfortably. She continued to work, but the upward trajectory of a career that had seemed so securely established was permanently altered. She had lived a human life in public, and she paid the price that the era levied on women who did so in ways that fell outside the boundaries of approved behavior. Lorraine Day's situation unfolded largely in public view. The controversy had broken before the pregnancy. Our next star managed the reverse entirely, a private abundance of life so rich and so human that no period costume could fully contain it. The girl next door's very grown-up secret. By 1949, June Allyson was one of MGM's most dependable and most genuinely beloved stars. The husky voice that should not have worked but somehow worked perfectly. The wholesome blonde warmth, the particular quality of approachability that made her seem like someone you might actually know rather than a figure from a different order of existence entirely. These were the qualities the studio had recognized and built upon since she arrived in Hollywood in the early 1940s. She was the girl next door. She was the sweetheart. She was, in the phrase that attached itself to her and stayed. And exactly the kind of woman that audiences in the post-war era wanted to believe in. In 1949, MGM cast her as Jo March in their lavish Technicolor production of Little Women, one of the studio's most ambitious prestige pictures of the year, filled with some of the studio's most appealing young talent. Alongside Allyson were Elizabeth Taylor as Amy, Janet Leigh as Meg, and Margaret O'Brien as Beth. The production was designed as a monument to a certain vision of American innocence and family virtue, a vision that Louisa May Alcott had first committed to the page in 1868, and that had lost none of its appeal in the intervening 80 years. June Allyson was 31 years old, she was playing a 15-year-old girl, and she was pregnant. The set of Little Women was, by all accounts, a genuinely warm place to work. Elizabeth Taylor was 17 and already luminous in a way that turned heads even on an MGM lot full of beautiful people. Janet Leigh was 22 and eager. Margaret O'Brien, who had been making films since she was 4 years old, was the consummate professional of the group despite being the youngest. Those who were present during that production later recalled an unusual atmosphere of genuine affection among the 4 women playing the March sisters, a warmth that was not entirely manufactured for the cameras, a sense of something real having developed between them in the hours and days of shared work. It was a production built around the theme of sisterhood, and something resembling sisterhood had apparently taken hold among the women who were inhabiting it. Into this warmth, this particular cocoon of a production, June Allyson brought her secret, carried quietly, managed efficiently, invisible to everyone who was not specifically tasked with keeping it invisible. The irony was complete when you understood the rest of it. While Allyson was on that set, dressed in period costumes carefully adjusted to accommodate what could not be hidden, she and her husband Dick Powell were simultaneously completing the adoption of their first child, a daughter they had named Pamela. The studio knew, as the studio always knew. The costuming department made the adjustments that the costuming department had been making for female stars throughout the history of the industry. Cameras found their angles, shooting schedules bent to what they needed to bend to. The girl next door performed American Girlhood for the cameras, and no one in the audience suspected for a moment that the woman behind the performance was in the process of becoming a mother in 2 directions at once. Then one afternoon, word reached the set that Pamela had arrived at their home for the first time. June Allyson, without asking anyone's permission, without pausing to consider the professional implications of what she was doing, walked off the set, got in her car, drove home, and held her daughter. She returned before her absence became a formal problem. Colleagues who were present that day later recalled it as entirely characteristic. The decision of a woman who knew, without needing to reason through it, what mattered most. The studio could have the performance. The rest of it was hers. Her son, Richard Powell Jr., was born on December 24, 1950, thus a little over a year after Little Women completed production. Allyson spoke of her children in later years with the uncomplicated happiness of someone who had found, in that particular corner of her life, exactly what she was looking for. The image MGM had constructed. The girl next door, perpetually young, perpetually uncomplicated, bore no relationship to the full, rich, joyful human life being lived just behind it. She was playing girlhood for the cameras, while simultaneously, in the most literal possible sense, becoming a mother. The gap between the performance and the reality was as wide as it ever gets in Hollywood, and she navigated it with a grace that belonged entirely to her. June Allyson's secret was one of joyful abundance. Too much life to conceal behind a period costume. Our final story belongs to a woman whose secret was its opposite. A quiet, private grief, carried in silence for years, that became the foundation for a lifetime of extraordinary compassion. The losses she never showed. There is a particular quality to Audrey Hepburn's screen presence that has never been entirely explained or replicated. The luminosity, the doe-eyed gaze, the bearing that seemed to belong simultaneously to a very young girl and to someone who had understood something essential about the world. It was, and remains, unlike anything else the cinema has produced. Audiences around the world responded to it as though it were addressing something in them personally that other performers had never quite reached. What those audiences saw was entirely real. What they did not see was equally real, and the two things were connected in ways that only became clear much later. Audrey Hepburn wanted children with an intensity that her public image, all lightness, all grace, all seemingly effortless elevation above the ordinary complications of a human life, never suggested. She became pregnant. She lost the pregnancy. The grief of that loss was absorbed privately, carried without display, managed with the discipline of a woman who had learned very early in her life that survival required a certain containment of feeling. She became pregnant again. She lost that pregnancy too. Those who were close to her during these years described a woman who continued to function at the highest level of professional demand while carrying a private sorrow that she did not offer to the world because she did not consider the world entitled to it. But she was Audrey Hepburn. She smiled for the photographers. She gave the performances. And she went home to a grief that fame could not touch and adoration could not reach. The decisions she made about her career during this period, the roles she declined, the productions she stepped away from, the periods of relative absence from the screen, were read at the time as the choices of a star with the leverage to be selective. They were, in significant part, the choices of a woman protecting the possibility of a pregnancy she was not certain she could sustain. The public version of the story and the private version of the story occupied the same events and reached entirely different conclusions. Her son, Sean Hepburn Farrer, was born on July 17, 1960. Hepburn spoke of that birth in terms that, across the subsequent decades, remained entirely consistent. It was the greatest joy of her life, uncomplicated by qualification or competition with anything else she had experienced. The relief and the gratitude in her descriptions of that period were, to those who knew what had preceded it, entirely comprehensible. She had wanted this, and she had lost it, and she had wanted it again, and now it was here. And nothing that had come before, no award, no film, no occasion of public triumph, prepared her for what it felt like. Friends who visited her in those early months of motherhood described a woman who was, for perhaps the first time in her adult life, entirely unguarded. The elegance was still there. It was simply part of her. But the careful composure that had always accompanied it had softened into something more open, more undefended. She held Sean the way someone holds something they had almost lost, which is to say, with a particular quality of attention that the people around her found quietly affecting to witness. Those who knew her best said the experience of finally becoming a mother after everything that had preceded it did not change her so much as it completed her, as though some essential part of her had been waiting, patiently and privately, for exactly this. What came afterward completed the story in a way that no scriptwriter could have improved upon. In her final years, Hepburn accepted an appointment as Goodwill Ambassador for the United Nations Children's Fund, UNICEF, and threw herself into that work with the same totality she had once brought to her performances. She traveled to Ethiopia, to Somalia, to Sudan, to Turkey, to Bangladesh, to Guatemala, and to El Salvador. To the places in the world where children's lives were most fragile and most in need of the attention of someone with the ability to draw the world's gaze. In 1988, she traveled to Ethiopia during a period of devastating food scarcity. Those who accompanied her on that journey described a woman who stepped off the plane into conditions of almost unimaginable adversity and did not flinch, did not perform distress for the cameras, did not retreat into the protective distance that public figures so often maintain between themselves and suffering. She sat on the ground with children who were gravely weakened by hunger and illness. She held them. She spoke to them in the quiet, unhurried voice of someone with all the time in the world. The same voice that had made millions of moviegoers feel, sitting in darkened theaters, that she was speaking to them and them alone. The photographers who were present said it was the most extraordinary thing they had ever witnessed. Not the suffering, which was everywhere, but the quality of her attention, which was absolute and unperformed and unmistakably genuine. One photographer who accompanied her on multiple journeys said that watching her with those children was the only time in his professional life that he put his camera down, not because there was nothing worth capturing, but because some moments feel too real to photograph. Those who accompanied her on those journeys described a woman who was entirely at home, in circumstances that would have been unendurable for most people. The losses she had carried in private had given her, it seemed, a particular understanding of what children's lives were worth, because she had felt, in her own body and her own private hours, how easily that worth could be taken away. The grief and the grace were not separate things. They had never been separate things. The private sorrow had always been the source of public compassion, even when the world could only see one of them. Audrey Hepburn left this world on January 20th, 1993, in Tolochenaz, Switzerland, at the age of 63. She had spent the final years of her life doing the work she considered most important. She carried it out, as she had carried everything else, with a composure that concealed nothing and explained everything. The golden age was never as simple as it looked. It never is. What looks like effortless glamour from the outside is almost always, on the inside, an act of extraordinary will. The daily decision to show up, perform, and give the world the version of yourself it has decided it wants, regardless of what you are actually carrying. These 9 women carried more than most. They carried it in silence, in fitted costumes, on active film sets, under studio lights that illuminated everything the camera was pointed at, and nothing it was not. What they were protecting, the pregnancies, the secrets, the private griefs and private joys, was simply their own humanity. The right to be fully human in a world that had purchased something narrower from them. Most of them never spoke about it publicly until decades had passed, if they spoke about it at all. Some of them took it entirely with them when they left this world. And then the audiences who loved them, who lined up at theaters and gathered around television sets and wrote fan letters by the thousands, never knew, because they were never meant to. That is the thing about a secret kept perfectly. It does not leave a hole. It leaves the performance intact and luminous, and the performance is what endures. We watch these women now, and we see what they gave us. Knowing what it cost them to give it does not diminish any of it. If anything, it makes the gift feel exactly like what it always was. Something offered freely, at considerable personal expense, by women who understood that the show, as they say, must go on. It went on. It always did. And here we are, still watching. If this journey through Hollywood's hidden history moved you, then please give this video a like. It helps more classic Hollywood fans find their way to these untold stories. And share it with someone in your life who loves the Golden Age as much as you do. Until next time, this is Golden Age Files, honoring the full, complicated, luminous humanity of the women who built Hollywood's most enduring dreams. Thank you, as always, for watching.